Hello and welcome. I'm Kayla Scrivener and I've DNF'd a whole lot of books recently, which is strange because I am not typically a DNFer. I have an issue with the currently reading shelf that just remains steadily growing all the time because I have ADHD and I flip between books all the time and I'm like, I'll go back by these. So some of these are books that I started recently and I could not feel them. I've had like a little bit of harder time in a slump, so I've DNF'd a lot of books and been like, okay, I'm not going to torturously go through this book. And some of these books are books that I hopefully left on my Goodreads to read, and I don't know, I feel like I might actually go back to them more if I actually pick them up from the DNF pile rather than constantly being like, yeah, that book is sitting there, but I don't want to read it. So one of the ones that I really wanted to make work and just could not was Crow by Ted Hughes. I thought this was interesting, the idea of a crow, which is like a manifestation of grief. Ted Hughes was the husband of Sylvia Plath and who famously left her right before she committed suicide, and a lot of things are about that. And he'd written Crow, a lot of those poems after her death, but also after the woman that he left for Sylvia Plath then also committed suicide. So he has had a lot of grief in his life, and I really wanted to read this because I know that there is a book called Grief is the Thing with Feathers by Max Porter that I wanted to read for a long time, and I know Crow is in there. But I did read at least 30 poems of this, and some of them were really interesting. Some of them I just didn't like, I didn't get. I like more emotional, less theoretical things. I really like academic reflections, but not necessarily in my poetry. And my friend, she just started her PhD in history, and we were sitting in the spring, and I was trying to read these, and I was like, let me read you some of these poems. And she was like, yeah, no. I consider myself a lover of poetry. She also writes poetry. If we both hate this so much, maybe I should stop trying to push through. I've been trying to read Ariel for so long. This is one of Sylvia Plath's well-known poetry collections. It was edited by Ted Hughes after her death and published, and I wanted to read it. The Bell Jar is one of my favorite books. I felt so seen in it. I read it way back in 2018, and I remember seeing it and hearing it, and the mental health representation for me was landmark. I stayed up all night and read it, and I've always wanted to love Sylvia Plath since, and I've tried Ariel a few times, and then I keep on rereading, and I don't like it. I know I've read examples of her poetry and stuff like that online before, and I liked it, so I always assumed I would like Ariel, and I just don't. The funny thing is I tried so much with it, and I tried again after Mary Ventura and the Ninth Kingdom, because this is a book that I read last year, and I really love it. I think about it so much, and it's the short story that she wrote in college. So I know that I like her prose writing. I just don't think I like her as a poet, which is interesting. So this is a husband and wife team that I don't think I'll be revisiting anytime soon. The next few have to do with Jane Austen July. I love Jane Austen July. I read a bunch of retellings during the month, and these two I just could not get into. And the first one was Longbourn by Jo Baker. So this one is told from the servant's point of view at Longbourn, which is the estate that the Bennets live in Pride and Prejudice. And it's just not something that was going to go for me. I did not like the narrative voice. And it's a 2011 book, and it feels that way in the most 2011 way. I grew up, I was a person reading in that era, and there's some tropes and stuff that I just don't love, and there is lines that people reflect. Elizabeth Bennet is so well regarded for traipsing through the mud, and the servant is I feel like she would do it less if she had to clean her own petticoats, and there's that class aspect and stuff like that. But I just also there was this narration of this kind of bad boy servant coming, and her being so intrigued. I've never seen a man, and oh no, but then he doesn't look at me. And that's kind of what I mean. It's it's the tropes of that era that I was just this is not, it does not feel a Jane Austen kind of clever, interesting reflection. And I know that retellings do not always have to have the same voice of the original, but the reasons why I love Jane Austen is the class commentary and the wittiness and the deep reflections and stuff like that. And it just felt very surface level for me, and not very character driven or funny driven. And then I also tried The Clergyman's Wife, and this is by Molly Greeley. I'd previously read The Heiress by her, which is a retelling of Anne de Burgh's story, and I was so hyped for that, and I barely finished it. I wanted to finish it, but it was brutal for me to get through. So when I read about 2 hours of this book and could not get into it, I was you know what, I'm just gonna lay her aside as an author that I don't think I'm going to like. My next stop on the books of dnfing was Oryx and Crake, and this is by Margaret Atwood, an author I love and respect. This is a book that is commonly given to people in schools in Canada, and I know many people who read it. I was not one of those people who read it. I read The Kite Runner, which is one of my favorite books, so I'm really glad that I read that one. And maybe I would have enjoyed this in school, but like I was not really enjoying it, and like there was aspects that were intriguing me, but the big part is that there's like it's kind of just overview of like male gazy, like everything is kind of about sex. And like to me, that is always a big turnoff. I find it really hard to just sit in that male gaze voice. And I like know she's a female author and stuff, and like she's employing it for certain reasons, but to me, it was just like, I'm not really intrigued by this plot. I'm not really interested in what's happening. I don't care about the characters, and I'm not liking the point of view. So like, why would I continue? A book that I did not dislike at all. I actually was so intrigued for it, and I like got it from the library and immediately started it, and it was Unlikable Female Characters. And I was so excited because it's kind of looking through the various women and how they're represented, and whether that's like the slut. It goes through and unpacks what that means. And I read probably 4 hours out of 12, and I was like really intrigued by a lot of it. And then I didn't find there was the same depth or like analysis. Like a lot of it was one of the characters from like Secession and like really digging into her and stuff. But as someone who hasn't read Secession, it just like, it didn't mean much to me. I think I wanted some of the reflection of like how it came into the real world, not just how it came in media studies. And the author is someone who writes from a media lens. So like, I like that, and I understand why that did her voice, but like I wanted a little more aspect. I think a great example of what I wanted a little more was Pandora'S Jar by Natalie Haynes. This is a similar thing, but it's deconstructing how the women are represented in Greek myths, from Pandora to Medea and etc. But I found that one much more engaging, and maybe it's because like I love ancient Greek stuff and I'm more familiar with a lot of their plots than I am with some of the characters she brought up. Like after 4 hours, I was like, okay, I also don't feel like I'm getting something new from this. And as someone who's like very involved in critiques about women on the internet and stuff like that, like I feel like, you know, it might be more engaging for someone who has been less part of that conversation. But I was like, I don't really want to listen to this for another 8 hours. Like, it's just not something that's appealing to me that much. And I don't feel like I'm learning from this or like being entertained by this or getting anything like new or novel from this. I wanted to DNF it and like not give a rating or anything because I don't want to discourage people from reading it, but I also was not really intrigued to continue myself. Okay, the next books don't really have like a lot of things against them. I just like didn't get into them for various things. The first one is The Poppy War. I like R.F. Kuang. I loved Yellowface. I loved Babel. I think that sometimes going backwards in someone's catalog of books can be hard because you've seen them develop as an author. I've been in a very slumpy mood. Like I feel like I could enjoy this at a different time, and I only read a few of the first few hours of it. So hopefully I will reemerge and get this one. Another one was A Thousand Ships. I just read Stoneblind and then Pandora'S Jar and was like obsessed with them, and I like couldn't get into this one in the same way. It's one of her earlier books by Natalie Haynes, and like I just complimented her on how much I liked her as an author. So I do think that I'll probably return to this one. Next two are books that I was reading in January. I read like 8 poems, and I had started both of these. And the first one is Time is a Mother, and this is by Ocean Vuong. And like I think this might be a permanent DNF because like I read his first collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds, and I liked some aspects, but I didn't like his flow, and like there were some aspects that I just really didn't like. And this is a book that I had started and like I was just feeling very mid about it, and I just was not really engaged with it, and I just don't think that he's necessarily the poet for me. I've also heard some ambivalent reviews from people who I respect as reviewers of poetry and who love poetry, so like I feel like this might be an off for me. And then Post-Colonial Love Poem. I read a fair bit of this. I feel like I probably read more than 20% of it. And like I didn't want to DNF it, but I just like again, like some of her poems were good. She writes like poems that are like a page or two and stuff like that, which sometimes I like that. Sometimes I like shorter poems, but I liked like sentences in this, but I didn't like entire poems. And I liked her topic and stuff like that. I liked a lot of the commentary she was making, but again, the poetry style was not working for me. And I feel like that's so hard as someone who loves poetry. Like the way someone is writing poetry really depends on whether you like it or not. So I wanted to continue on, but it's now been like 8 months, and I'm like, am I gonna go back to it? I don't know. And the rest of these are DNFs from a while ago. And this is Why Didn't We Ask Evans? I started reading this in September of last year, and it's been a year. So I feel like I've been like, I'm not gonna start another Agatha Christie until I finish this one. And I'm like, you know what, I'm not going to put that rule on myself. I read 6 or 8 Agatha Christie's last August and really enjoyed them, and then read this one and I wasn't fully getting into it, and then I DNF'd it. So like, yeah, I officially took it off my reading list. I've already talked about the Poppy War, and I'm just gonna hurt more souls with Jade City. I started this like years ago. I think I got 2 hours in. Again, I didn't like hate it. There was nothing that I hated. I was not feeling like a 21-hour audiobook, and like nothing was hooking me. I'm not against going back to this one, but I also don't know if it's one that I will return to. If I'm having another like fantasy like hype, I might. But I also maybe don't love adult fantasy in the same way I like YA fantasy, which is interesting because I love like adult fiction in general, and I sometimes struggle with YA fiction, but I think I struggle less with YA fantasy, which is an interesting angle that like, yeah, I think some of the things that are explored in fantasy and the way that adult fantasy kind of builds on that, I don't always love. Anyways, I'm still pondering that. I just don't really have an adult fantasy outside of S.A. Chakrabarty, which kind of is more blending the line between YA and that I really love. So yeah, like I like fantasy a lot, and I like adult works. I don't know if I love them together. And then the other one is Rage of Dragons. I read at least 3 to 4 hours of this. So like, it's quite a while, and it has been sitting there for quite a long time. I own it. You can't see it. Anyways, and again, I like some of the aspects. I just was not driven into it. And I think it's funny that I say I don't like adult fantasy because I write primarily adult fantasy. I sometimes get discouraged with my writing projects is because I know that my books are practically like literary fiction in a fantasy setting. I really like character-driven and theme and world building and like cultural commentary and stuff like that. I pretty much want to read like a Jane Austen book, or like I'm reading Anthony Trollope, and I'm like, that's my writing style. Like, that's what I love. Someone describes a book as like explosive and action-packed, I'm not interested. You know, like, I love superheroes with my whole heart. I just watched Blue Beetle and it was beautiful. And every time they were fighting, I was like, okay, it is cool for an aspect. Like, I don't mind watching fighting. It can be interesting, and like sometimes moves happen. Like The Last Kingdom is one of like the action scenes I love so much. But I was watching Blue Beetle and I was like, can we go back to the family stuff and have like slightly less of the fighting? Like, I love the aspects of the ways in which fantasy interacts with family dynamics, interacts with grief, interacts with the world. And I think that's super interesting to me. So yeah, I'm like, I don't know. I want to finish my writing projects. I want to publish them, but I want to be like, this is going to be slow. This is not going to be what someone often thinks with fantasy, but it's also going to have aspects of fantasy which a lot of literary people will turn up their nose about, which I think is also really terrible. And I'm like, there's a lot of people don't meet with fantasy and literary fiction, and I'm like, I love both equally in my heart, and I would like them both to be together. So anyways, I think that that's why I struggle with some of the fantasy books, because I'm like, I want some more other stuff. So the last one I feel sad about, I found this in a free little library several years ago. Do we have a date? We don't have a date. Anyways, and I quickly found it on audiobook and then realized that audiobook was an abridged version. So then I did the despicable thing, but it is a book that is in the public domain because it is an old book, and I looked up an audiobook version of it, and then that finished at 3/4 full. And so I read technically all but the last probably 10 chapters, but it also feels weird to go back to reading it. So it's a book that I like and I think about, and I read a bunch of his brother's books are now here because he appears as a character in here, and Gerald Durrell, and I find it really interesting. That was 2021, so it's been a while, and I've never finished the last 5 chapters of this. So I feel like it isn't a DNF, but it also is a DNF, but it also feels weird to start again or to pick up physically. So I just also My Family and Other Animals. It's quite funny, and it's technically a memoir, but it's quite not a memoir. Only my eldest brother, Larry, was untouched, but it was sufficient that he was irritated by our failings. It was Larry, of course, who started it. The rest of us fell too apathetic to think of anything except our own ills. But Larry was designed by Providence to go through life like a small, blonde firework, exploding ideas into other people's minds and then curling up with a cat-like I don't know what that word is, and refusing to take the blame for the consequences. I just like this book. I just need to start it again. But anyways, I feel like I need to DNF it so that I can one day start it again. But I can't take it off my reading thing, so I have read most of this book, and it is very funny. Anyways, that is my tour of books I've DNF'd recently, all pretty much in the last book. I also DNF'd Memphis way back in the earlier books, and a lot of people know the problematicness of it. I talk about it extensively in my Women's Prize original vlog, so if you're interested, you can hear my thoughts there. And have a great day, and I bid you adieu. That sounded weirdly formal.